Again, thank you very much indeed for the generosity, time, and effort, dear professor, for this nice opportunity. If you don't mind, I will start then a brief introductory note about you, and then we will add on with the questions. Professor Mary Kaldor is Professor Emeritus of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict Research Program at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has pioneered the concept of new wars and global civil society. Her elaboration of the real-world implementation of human security has directly influenced European and national governments. She's the author of many books and articles, including International Law and New Wars, Global Security Cultures, and the book that we are going to focus on today, New and Old Wars, Organized Violence in a Global Era. So thank you very much, Professor. I start with my first question. Tracing the inadequacies of the inherited ways of perceiving war, the book sets out the need for a new kind of analysis of political and cultural assumptions about how war is fought in the new era. It seems that according to your definition, war evolves, but you make a difference between old and new wars. Could you please outline the concept of new war for those who have not read the book?
Yes, I think when I wrote the book, it was very much about the empirical differences that I observed in the Balkans, particularly, and in other places. So they were wars that were not necessarily fought by states. They were fought by combinations of state and non-state actors. They were wars that were not fought in the name of ideology, or rather they were fought in the name of identity, sectarian identities, religious, Sunni versus Shia, Serb versus Croat. They were wars in which most of the violence was directed against civilians, and in which battles between the two sides were rare. And they were wars with a very specific political economy where the various warring parties were making money from violence itself, rather than depending on state finance, as I thought in the past. And of course, when I produced this book, which was back in 1999, it was criticized a lot, and people kept drawing attention to the fact that lots of things about it weren't new. And what I realized was that I wasn't really making an empirical distinction. I was making a conceptual distinction. I was really trying to say new and old wars were different. Maybe new was the wrong word, although it produced such a debate that maybe it was quite good because it drew attention to the differences. And I found it very useful in order to develop the difference, to study the theorist of classical wars, Clausewitz. So for Clausewitz, war is a contest of wills. He defines war as an act of will designed to compel your opponent to fulfill your will. It's an act of violence, sorry, not an act of will. And according to his definition, and all of this is contained in chapter 1 of book 1 of Clausewitz, which was the only chapter he actually wrote himself because he died and it was written by his wife. It necessarily tends to the extreme as each side tends to win. And he had something called the Trinity, the politicians, the generals, the people, all of them tend to the extreme. The politicians want to impose their will, the generals feel they need to disarm the opponent, and the people are sort of filled with hatred and fear. And what I realized is that this was the real difference. It was a fundamental difference in that these weren't wars that tended to extreme. It was better to describe these wars more like a mutual enterprise than a contest of wills. And so I redefined war. War is an act of violence involving 2 or 3 or more sides, or warring parties, but it doesn't necessarily, it's framed always in political terms. And if we look at contemporary wars, the key feature about them is that they are sort of mutual enterprises. They're social conditions, if you like, in which the various warring parties, the violent groups, actually benefit from violence itself rather than from winning or losing. And they benefit politically because the kind of identity politics that we see really are based on fear. In normal peaceful times, Shias and Sunnis don't hate each other. But if you're going to be killed because you're Sunni or Shia, you start to hate the other and you turn to the warring group for protection. But it's not just about ideology, it's also just simply about making money. The warring groups make money from looting, from kidnapping, from setting up checkpoints, from smuggling, and it's a good business as well. And when you try to explore, is it political or is it economic, it's so intertwined that you can't tell. In some cases, there are fanatical groups that need to engage in crime to fund themselves. And in other cases, there are criminal groups that find it useful to frame themselves as political. So the real difference between old and new wars is the difference between a contest of wills and a mutual enterprise. And if it's a mutual enterprise, it doesn't tend to the extreme. What it does is it tends to persistence. These kinds of wars are really, really difficult to end. They go on and on forever. Sometimes they're called forever wars. Afghanistan, Syria, the Congo, they just go on and on. And even in places like the Balkans, where sort of negotiated peace, or Lebanon has been reached, somehow they go on behaving as though they're at war with an ever-present danger of violence. So I think its kind of turning point was the end of the 1980s, and there's lots to be said about this. I mean, on the one hand, you had the change in the nature of the global economy and the emergence of what people call crony capitalism or oligarchy, as kind of centrally planned states went over to capitalism, and you had more and more people competing for access to the resources of the state. On the other hand, you also had much greater inequality and dissatisfaction among ordinary people. But a third element that I think was really important is that whereas in the 60s and 70s, if you were a young radical student, for example, your goal was to go to the mountains and join the revolutionary left. After 1989, when people observed the peaceful revolutions of 1989, those same young people simply wanted to become civil society activists. So there was, in a way, a divergence between, on the one hand, the people who wanted to change their societies to become democracy through civil society activism, and on the other hand, the kind of political entrepreneurs who recruited very often frustrated young men from the countryside to their militias and their groups. So that's the sort of beginning of this shift from old to new war.
It's fascinating, like this, even this change, let's say, territorial change from forest to mountain, and then from mountain to civil society. It's already wonderful. It's interesting, you know, like going to the heart of society.
Really, and I think when you look at new wars now, I'm not really answering your question about the table very much. I'm going beyond it. But I think the way to think, increasingly the way I think about new wars, is that they're a new kind of social condition. They're a sort of ism, like communism or socialism. I don't know what we can call it. I would love to find the right name, but it's an ism of military violent political and economic fragmentation that goes on reproducing itself. And it's become a sort of way of living. And it's the way in which authoritarian regimes respond to demands for democracy. You can't go back to a controlled system, but at least you can prevent democracy from winning. And you can prevent democracy from winning by creating this fragmented system. And actually, in all of the contemporary wars began this way. So, you know, the Yugoslav wars began with the transition to democracy and democratic movements. We saw what happened in Syria. And the question, I think, for people in Iran now is, there are these wonderful demonstrations going on. Is this going to be the way the regime and the revolutionary guards deal with it?
Right. Sure. I mean, that's also one of my questions that I would talk about later. But now, like, I mean, one of the let's say part and parcel of the new wars in your definition is that there is this element of identity politics there, which is not that present in the ideological wars. I mean, I would be extremely thankful if you could just elaborate on what exactly you mean by identity politics, especially I think because you trace it not only in places like Bosnia, but also in Syria and also in Afghanistan. I mean, so there are numerous examples in the book addressing this identity issue. I would be thankful.
Of course, as people have been said in criticism, identity is also an ideology. So maybe the distinction between ideology and identity politics wasn't the right one. But what I mean by, it's a very interesting about what identity politics means. It's the idea that you have a right to the state on the basis of your identity. And it's an exclusive identity. And it's about labels. It's not about the substance of identity. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take the conflict, for example, in Northern Ireland, which is between Protestants and Catholics, it's a religious sectarian conflict, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the differing ideas of Protestantism and Catholicism. You know, originally in the 18th century, there were religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. And they were really about destroying the power of the church, which was Catholic. They were about the role of the individual. They were about taking the Bible seriously. Now, there are, if you look at conflicts over Islam, of course, there are people who take Sharia law seriously. But actually, it's not about Sharia law. It's about we're the Muslims who've been victimized. And as Muslims, we have a right to be respected. We have a right to control the state. And even more, this is true of the Shia Sunni. I mean, it's nothing to do with the killing of Hussein or whatever. It's nothing to do with the substance of the differences. It's all to do with whether you're Shia or Sunni. And Syria is a really interesting case because it's not a society, at least not so my Syrian colleagues tell me, that is typically very sectarian. You know, the Alawi in the government are a tiny minority. And it was constructed during the first years of the war. On the one hand, the government wanted to claim that the opposition were Sunni terrorists, and they deliberately targeted Sunni areas, and they used Alawite militias. On the other hand, a whole lot of extremists in the Gulf paid for militias from the opposition. And actually, just because they were paid, they had to take on the colors of their donors. They were quite open about how they did that. they had to take the religious slogan. So you've got a situation in which what started as a struggle about democracy was really successfully channeled into a conflict about sectarianism. And that's exactly what happened in Bosnia. It started being about democracy, not about who was Muslim and who was Serbian. And so what I mean, that's what I mean by, and it means identity as a label, not as an idea. And it's very strange when you think about it, because we all have multiple identities and we use one. Most of us are mixed. I've very rarely come across anybody who isn't completely mixed and doesn't have different people in their background from different religions. So it's ridiculous to think that your identity is only one. But also your identity isn't only about your cultural background. It's about, you know, are you a mother? Are you a scholar? You know, whatever identity you choose to emphasize varies from time to time and at moments of your life. And it's this notion of fixed identity, Amartya Sen calls it solitaristic identity, that is so important in these wars, and they're created through binary conflict. Sartre said it's the anti-Semite that makes the Jew. And in the same way, it's only when, as I said before, it's only when you're threatened because of your identity that it becomes really important.
Great, wonderful. It's just perfectly clear to me what you mean. Just the only thing was that, I mean, usually you hear the word identity politics, not in the international understanding of violence, but usually in the among the minorities, among the different social groups, you know, like Black Lives Matter, LGBTs, you know.
Maybe we should say extremist identity politics, because what is the case, and I think it's a point that Alain Touraine used to make a lot, that, you know, we had this shift from politics being about class structure and about class to politics being about identity, and identity could be sexual identity or cultural identity or whatever, and that's true.
You have added in the third edition of the book, again, a chapter on Iraq and Afghanistan, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. As you say, the reason behind it was, I quote you, to show the clash between what I call technology-updated old war and the new war in both places. So what is the difference between the updated old war, which is like usually technologically updated, and the new wars?
Actually, I wonder about whether I was right in that kind of way I presented it. Now I talk about it. I mean, what I meant there was that in the case of Iraq, this was a state war, and it was very much like an old war, but it had all this, very much like empirically like an old war, in the sense that it was about invading a country, controlling a country. It was involved regular forces controlled by the state and all of that kind of thing to begin with. I mean, that's how it was seen to begin with. But then, in fact, it disintegrated into a new war. And certainly if by new war you mean a mutual enterprise, which I said before, I think that's what the US war on terror became, and still is. That actually the US needed the war on terror because it had lost the Cold War. And the idea that America was sort of fighting for freedom against people who are threatening freedom is so central to its own self-identity. And the war on terror provided that. And in many ways, if you I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because I realized the Cold War was also a mutual enterprise. So am I actually just but I think it's more useful to use the term new wars to refer to conflicts like we see in Syria and Congo. But nevertheless, these other wars do have some similarities. I mean, in fact, the US was making considerable use of private security contractors, so it wasn't any longer making use of regular forces. It was engaging in airstrikes rather than engaging in battle. And of course, the airstrikes were directed against military targets, but nevertheless, there were civilian casualties. And it was also, I think, a very important feature of new wars is that they're state unbuilding rather than state building. So I described to you Charles Tilley's argument that the state increased taxation, increased public spending, and became more and more and established a national identity during wars. In a curious way, these wars do the opposite. They're not funded by that, Baudrillard's point, the Gulf War didn't happen, is really relevant here because nobody's touched by it. It's a small group that goes and carries them out, and all you see on television is a sort of target. You don't see the reality of the war, the bombing, and at the same time, the war on terror creates more terrorists, and the terrorists justify the war on terror. So it is a sort of continuing mutual enterprise. So maybe I was wrong to call it updated.
But anyway, it's very, it makes a lot of sense to me, especially when I see that, there are other authors. I mean, I was reading and also talking to Susanna Schneider, the American political scientist. She also has the same argument about the relevance or even the interrelation between jihadi wars and neoliberal precarious kind of wars. I mean, this is absolutely sensible. Yet now that you're talking about Baudrillard, I'm just like, en passant, I just remember, I just asked this question quite spontaneously, that do you think that if we imagine sanction and sanctioning as a kind of new war mechanism, can we call it as a kind of war that never takes place?
Yes, and is it an old or a new war?
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's no question that the Americans impose sanctions in order to bring about compliance, but actually they do the opposite. So if you look at the sanctions on Syria or Iraq or whatever, they're always blamed on the West, and they contribute to corruption and disintegration, and they make the conditions that lead to new wars worse. So why did the Americans do it? And certainly, I think we'll probably come to Ukraine in a moment. They really thought this would affect Russia and make it impossible for Russia to fight this war. But as a matter of fact, they've been much less effective than was imagined.
It's interesting, if I'm allowed, just I was reading an article exactly last week, 17th of February in New Yorker, and from the American historian Stefan Kotkin. And so in the part of the interview, which is called How the War in Ukraine Ends, and he talks about the conflict, the war actually between Russia and Ukraine, and claims that although there are hopes for Ukraine, sanctions won't work. I'm quoting him: despite the sanctions, the Russian economy didn't shrink, let alone shrink massively. It turns out that the Russian people proved extremely adaptable to the sanctioned regime and figured out how to survive, and in some cases, how to prosper. Russian imports are back and Russian exports are back. Russian employment is looking okay. Yes, the figures are a secret, but there are indirect ways that we can figure it out. End of quote. So what do you think of sanctions? Again, my question, as a mechanism defined in the scope of new war strategies. I mean, can we think of sanctions as a part of a new war rather than an interlude to the war in the classical definition that happened to Iraq, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think sanctions speed up new wars.
Mm.
That's what they did in Syria and Iraq. I mean, in the case of Russia, it's been really interesting because they've found ways to get around it. But if you look at Serbia, Syria, Iraq, all it did was to feed corruption, to create, it really constructed the kind of—
the same with Iran, I mean.
Yeah, the kind of crony capitalists who keep new wars going. And ordinary people who suffered, they were the ones who suffered, but they were happy to blame it on the West, not to blame it on their governments. So it had completely contrary effects to what were expected. And yet they go on using this tool because they can't think of any other tool. And I think, I mean, this is to do with sanctions and the mutual enterprise. All of it goes back to my point right at the beginning about the Second World War making people realize that war is impossible, that we can't have a Clausewitzian type war nowadays because it would lead to human extinction.
Mm-hmm.
And yet people want to be able to use violence for political ends. And so they try to use sanctions, they try to use, and actually what we need is a shift, not from this kind of war model, but a shift to a law model. You know, what we should be doing is trying to arrest jihadists. They're very evil people, but actually treating them as enemies dignifies them.
Interesting.
And so what we need is a very, very different approach from the war approach, the approach that we have in domestic contexts, where we talk about the rule of law. Of course, in some places it's very repressive and we don't want that, but nevertheless, it is different.
There is a I mean, you say that, I mean, the state's capacity to confront has decreased, as you say in the book, and using force in a unilateral way against other states has been in decline. For this, you name two reasons. One is transnationalism from above, and the other is privatization from below, if I'm not wrong. You add that, I'm quoting you, the barbarity of the war between states may have become a thing of the past. In its place is a new type of organized violence that is more pervasive and long-lasting, but also perhaps less extreme, end of quote. Does it mean that we have to stick to identity politics and abandon geopolitical or ideological concerns? It is something that, I mean, I can understand horizontal ways of resistance, as people like Hart, Negri, or Deleuze would suggest. But does it mean that power, for example, in the Middle East, is absolutely horizontal and there is no vertical geopolitical, let's say, contest?
Well, I think at the heart of geopolitics is the idea that you can threaten militarily the other state. And if that's no longer possible, geopolitics becomes a sort of imaginary. It's not real any longer. You can pretend to threaten the other state, but nobody really believes it. And that's why we need a different type of international system. We need the emergence of regional organizations. We need the emergence of global institutions. We need an increasing emphasis on international law that's based on human rights rather than on the rules of war. And there are some countries that think like that. The Europeans think like that. Canada thinks like that. Japan thinks like that. And, you know, I think it's the only option for the future, and that if you continue to think in geopolitical terms, well, either it leads to the extinction of human race, if it leads to a war, or it leads to a kind of permanent global fragmentation, a global new war.
Yeah, I mean, but those countries which don't think like that, I mean, aside from their egocentric, let's say, selfish background or this myopic view, they're also they also have some history of being, I mean, of losing that trust in the international sense. You know, like as an Iranian, you still have these ressentiment against like the coup d'etat, you know, that happened in Iran, which is not easy to overcome, I would say. So it's not only the trust that let's join the international league in fighting, you know, like or appraising the like peace, but there are also historical. There is a question of memory. There is a question of, you know, yeah, I mean, you have some memories, you have some history, you have like 80 years of war, you have a long, like 2-3 decades of sanctions. Um, I mean, which I think they function also as some obstacles against joining the international. I mean, I'm not justifying any politics. I'm just like they both work side by side.
Well, I think I agree with you, and that's why thinking about, I guess, transnational civil society is very important in this connection. You may not trust other governments. You may not, you certainly, if you're Iran, you don't feel like trusting the United States or whoever. But you may engage on a civil society basis, which could change. I mean, and, you know, if you have, it requires sort of those organizations that are committed to a human rights-based international,
Right.
such as the European Union or the United Nations, acting in very different ways.
I had, it's no more ad hoc, a kind of ad hoc sort of, it was a kind of curiosity when it comes to, I mean, the role of gender when it comes to new war was interesting for me, especially when it was like, so it was coincident, my reading of your book was coincident with what was happening in Iran. And so I was thinking that what is the role of women in the new wars? I mean, somewhere you talk about danger in some of your lectures, but I'm still curious about it. Given that the likes of Clausewitz introduced war as a social activity, and this social activity was, and I mean, usually was restricted to men and men's power, can we claim that women have also managed to take a new role in the new wars?
Let me say that the old wars are associated with what we might call a modernized version of gender roles. So, you know, there's the idea of the man as the heroic soldier who fights to defend his women at home. And of course, wars were never quite like that. On the one hand, there was always a lot of rape and sexual abuse. And on the other hand, the women often had to work to mobilize. So it was never quite like that, but that was the idea. And very much when I talk about the difference between new and old wars, I'm talking about the difference between the wars that we observe and the wars that are in our heads. So, and I think in our heads, we always see war as a contest, which is why the international community always wants to negotiate between the warlords, the horrible people, and never involve ordinary people. But I think the interesting thing with new wars is that they are actually associated with very extremist form of gender hierarchy. Whether you're talking about the jihadists or whether you're talking about Serb and Croat nationalists, for them, or Putin, I mean, they have a very strong feeling about, they're very angry with women, actually. And these wars also involve systematic violence against women, but also in some cases, sexual relations become the goal of war itself. I mean, in the case of ISIS, you know, you fight and you get a woman. or maybe more than one woman. The same with Boko Haram or the Lord's Resistance Army. So that, and it's a sort of very extreme version of patriarchy that actually contributes to the reproduction of wars, in my view. It's a sort of unstable form of masculinity that can only be reproduced through new wars, through violence. So I think there's very much different gender relations, but of course in new wars, unlike old wars, which mobilized everybody, the people who fight are quite a minority. And so there are lots of other men and women. And I think particularly interesting is what you observe is that women are very often at the forefront of civil society. Women are the ones who are leading demonstrations, whether it's in Iran or Iraq or South Sudan. Women are the ones who are often contributing to humanitarian response and so on and so forth. So there is a quite alternative way of thinking about gender being fought out in this war between, which are really wars not between two groups, but they're wars between, if you like, violent groups and civility. And civility necessarily involves a much more equal set of gender relations.
Interesting, thank you. In a part of the book, you talk about Iran-Iraq war, at least in the version that I have, in the edition that I have. I mean, I read that part, and I would be extremely thankful if you can elaborate on that. The quote is, since 1945, there have been very few interstate wars, and these, India and Pakistan, Greece and Turkey, Israel and Arab states, were generally restrained by superpower intervention. The exception, which proves the rule, was the Iran-Iraq war. This war lasted for 8 years and could be waged unilaterally because of the availability of oil revenues. Both sides learned this utility of the modern conventional warfare, end of quote. I don't completely grasp the relation between oil revenues and the
well, all I think I meant about the oil revenues, though there's lots to be said about oil revenues, was that they had state money and therefore they could fight a war along state lines. If you look at places like Bosnia or Syria or whatever, there wasn't enough taxation to fund. They were totally dependent on external sources. And so they had enough money to fight an old war, which is not the case in many places. But the other reason I think it was the exception that proved the rule was that it ended up being very much like the First World War, a sort of war of attrition that no side could win. And something we're maybe seeing in Iraq and in Russia and Ukraine, that if you really try to win, you can't, which is why, you can't win any longer a war. You can use it for other purposes, but you can't win. You may gain from war itself. And this is my feeling, what Putin is interested in. He doesn't need to win. He just needs to turn Ukraine into a long-term permanent war. And that will be what winning means.
Interesting. I mean, the same author I was quoting in New Yorker, he's exactly talking about it this way, that, I mean, okay, I'm not in peace. I will not let them also in peace. It's like, it's a way putting things. Interesting. There is a part of the book again talking about Bosnia. You talk about the I don't know which of his books, like David Reeves' idea, what he wrote about Bosnia. So I quote you, David Reeves describes how Bosnian Serb soldiers, after a day of shooting from the hills around Sarajevo, would ring their Muslim friends in the town. This extraordinary contradictory behavior made perfect sense to the soldiers because of the psychological dissonance produced by this virtual reality. They were not shooting at the private friends, but at Turks. End of quote. So it's interesting. Here you talk about the war that is happening. If I'm not wrong, the war that's happening in the heads, like the virtual war. And again, it reminded me of we talked about Baudrillard. It reminded me of in the introduction to the English translation of the Gulf War didn't take place. Paul Patton says that in the midst of the Gulf War, CNN approaches one of the reporters sent to the Gulf while they were also watching CNN to find out what is happening. It's interesting. I mean, it's as if it's like these forever wars, you know, like it's happening everywhere.
Exactly.
Please.
I don't know that I have a comment on that, but I think it is interesting that I think new technologies from the beginning of new wars played a very important role in that fear is what is being generated. And so the more that you have atrocities on television, and in the beginning, you know, when I wrote New War, we didn't have social media. And, you know, they were using videos and internet. Well, internet only began during the Bosnian War, actually. So, but what you see, Syria is just covered by everything. And the lies that are happening on social media is just unbelievable. So you can't distinguish truth from fiction at all. Nobody knows what's happening. I mean, the story, thousands and thousands of social media tweets and pictures, and some of them are false, some of them are not. How do you know?
Exactly. There is a point that I sort of, I mean, not only obsessed me, but a lot of people in Iran, throughout all the uprisings that happened last 3, 4, 5 months, was that, I mean, I tried to formulate it in this question that if the new kind of war is influencing the international old models, why not influencing the civil society and protests and oppositions? You know, if you don't know, if you can't decide if they are political or economical, if we know that they are less direct, if we know that they are more visual, if we know that they are happening in their heads, it can also happen to the, I mean, the oppositions, they are no exempt. They're not exempt from it. It can also happen to the oppositions. I mean, like imagine you be in Iran and there are protests outside in the street, but you go and watch television, which is, I don't know, in Washington or in London or in Berlin, you know, in order to make sense of what is happening in your neighborhood. So, I mean, it's not only happening to power; it's also happening to the oppositions. It's also happening to the civil society. You know, this kind of indirectness. Let's say this kind of, you know, is it sensible? I mean, like my question.
Yeah, well, so obviously it can be positive as well as negative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can mobilize so much more easily than you used to be able to. When I was young, if you wanted to organize a demonstration, you needed an address list. You were lucky if you got something in the newspaper so people could read it. Now you just put out something on the internet and everyone knows about the demonstration. You can organize it incredibly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and, you know, you can also influence how people understand what's happening too, which is really important. And you can influence it in a positive way as well as a negative way.
Definitely. I mean, it's absolutely ambivalent, my position too. But my question was that, so it's not only the power that is transforming, it's also the the protest against power is also that is also changing.
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose my question always is, I mean, my introduction to civil society was in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, and the success of the 1989 revolutions left me with a huge belief in social movements. And it's quite hard to go on believing this after the experience of the last 20 years. And I think particularly 2011, you know, I felt this was the moment when Al-Qaeda and ISIS were being marginalized politically. There was a civic uprising among people of the Middle East, and they were distinct from these. And I was really optimistic about it. And of course, everywhere they were defeated, which makes you feel, so can you go on being optimistic in this current, can we be optimistic about Iran? And one of the things in my program, we've developed this idea of civicness rather than civil society. And I did that because so often civil society is identified with NGOs, and so often NGOs are simply created by their donors. But what I wanted to get at was two things. One was that in all these new war situations, people act in civic ways. And in fact, society would not survive if there weren't doctors and teachers and even civil servants who took their jobs seriously. And if there weren't local groups who provided humanitarian aid, who kept the schools going and all of those kinds of things. And the question is, that is very deep in society. And is that what keeps new wars going, allows people to survive in these situations, or does it offer the germs of an alternative? And I think a lot has to do with the way the outside world behaves. Because in general, the outside world, they have in their mind an old war picture. So if they're going to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, for instance, it means negotiations between Russians and Ukrainians about some political solution, which won't be fair or just or anything. Or if you're going to find peace in Afghanistan, you talk to the warlords and the Taliban. And actually, I think if you're going to find peace, the only people who can really help you are the civic activists. They're the only people who can really help you find peace. But they don't get that. And the question is, how do you build these partnerships? I mean, we did a lot of research on civicness, and it did turn out that it was, if you like, the engagement with civic internationalism that makes things work. Just to give you an example, in Iraq, there were journalists trying to expose corruption. They were only able to do it when they were part of the Panama Papers, which was an international consortium, because then the Iraqi authorities, it was much harder for them to touch them. So if you think in those terms, you can think of other examples. We had examples in Syria of kind of diaspora activists who've been hugely important in negotiating local peace agreements, for example. So I think that's a kind of way to go, but we need to think that through a bit.
It's interesting you talk about the role of diaspora. I think that as an Iranian, I sense it that this role has been increasingly difficult to play really ethically and politically. Like what happened was that a lot of times when protests in Iran happen, the diaspora outside forgets that in order to support those people in Iran, and in order to be voice of them in the international way, they have to link it to the international agenda of fighting injustice, fighting racism, fighting sexism, and so on and so forth. But what happens, to my disappointment sometimes, is that the diaspora here, they link, or let's say they hijack the voice of those who are protesting in Iran, and they just sell them to the right-wing activists, let's say in Italy, in France, in Germany. You know, like what happened a couple of days ago was that a couple of them, in an assembly of Iranians, they were talking in Italian parliament, hosted by the North League in Italy, and they are talking about the women, life, freedom slogan of women in Iran. And it is absolutely unethical. Not only unethical, it brings everything to...
It's ridiculous, but didn't the demonstrators, didn't the Iranians realize how stupid it was?
Yeah, the Iranians in Iran, either they realize it or they just ignored it. But the fact is that a lot of Iranians here, again, to my disappointment, they just accept that, like, okay, in order to overthrow or in order to support the protests in Iran, they have to side with the right-wing, either monarchist or, you know, or the...
So what we need, as George Conrad used to say, is a kind of international coalition of dissidents.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much for the time. Thank you very much for the book. And I really enjoyed the conversation, the book.
Yeah, me too. Great.
Yeah.
We'll meet again somewhere, somehow.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you very much. And I wish you a great weekend, Mary.